I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Moscow's airports are once again shut down by Ukrainian drones, we hear about Russian officers apparently assassinated in the occupied territories, as it's revealed Trump told his European counterparts Putin does not want to end the war. Plus, we hear about the educational challenges faced by refugees and the evolving nature of civil society in a country at war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 22nd of May, 3 years and 88 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Education Editor, Poppy Wood, and also in the studio, Serhiy Prytula, founder of the Serhiy Prytula Foundation and a major public figure in Ukraine. But first, over to Dom for the latest from the battlefield.
OK, let's start inside Russia. And Moscow's airports were temporarily shut down this morning, Russia's aviation watchdog Rosaviatsia said. Arrivals and departures were suspended after Ukraine launched a massive drone attack against Russia, with dozens of drones said to be fired at the Russian capital. The second night in a row such attacks have been launched, resulting in the closure of multiple airports. Now, Russia claims it shot down 105 drones overnight, including 35 over the capital. Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, said all the drones were heading towards the city. All four of Moscow's main airports, Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, Domodedovo and Zhukovsky, were forced to close as a result. There's not much to report from the ground in Russia, but President Zelensky did say that Ukrainian forces remain active, his word, active in the Russian regions of Kursk and Belgorod. In his evening address last night, he said, "The most intense situation remains in the Donetsk region, particularly in the Pokrovsk direction. We are also continuing active operations in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. This is our active and effective defence of Sumy and Kharkiv regions." Now, as President Zelensky said, on the ground inside Ukraine, the only real move was in the Donbass, as we've seen in recent weeks. Very minor moves by Russia, minor advances to the southwest of Pokrovsk and the southwest of Konstantinivka. More comment about Sumy Oblast shortly. Across Ukraine, Russian attacks yesterday killed 2, injured 27 others. There were 128 drones and an Iskander-M ballistic missile fired by Russia into the country last night, the Air Force said. Now, 4 Chechen officers from the Russian-backed Akhmat unit were killed on Tuesday in a car bomb near the occupied city of Skadovsk in Kherson Oblast. That's about 40 km south of Kherson city on the coast. This news comes from the Ukrainian military intelligence agency, HUR, speaking this morning. According to the agency, the car exploded between Skadovsk and Antonivka in the occupied part of Kherson Oblast. The HUR said the first blast was followed by more explosions as the occupants of the car were thought to be transporting ammunition that then detonated. Now, while the Ukrainian intelligence department did not explicitly claim responsibility for the incident, they never really do, it did say that, quote, "there will be just retribution for every war crime committed against the Ukrainian people." Now, the next one, a Russian vessel under international sanctions made suspicious manoeuvres near a key undersea power cable connecting Poland and Sweden before being forced to retreat following a military intervention, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said yesterday. So writing on X, he said, "After the effective intervention of our military, the ship sailed to one of the Russian ports." It comes after, you'll remember, last Thursday's incident where Estonian Coast Guard ships were buzzed by a Russian fighter jet having deployed to inspect a Shadow Fleet vessel that was transiting past Estonia. That Russian jet flying through Estonian airspace for about a minute, Markus Sakna, the Estonian foreign minister, said last week. Now then, we reported on Monday that Putin had apparently visited Kursk Oblast recently. The date wasn't known, but the news came out on Monday. There were pictures of him meeting acting Kursk Oblast Governor Alexander Kinstein. Apparently, he also met with Pavel Zolotarev, the head of the Glushkovy region. That's basically a district in Kursk Oblast, about 40 km to the west of Suja. Now, reporting from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, says Mr. Zolotarev asked Putin to create a buffer zone in Sumy Oblast, to which Putin apparently asked how many kilometres deep this buffer zone should be. Zolotarev had a think about it and said Russia should seize at least Sumy city. And then Kinstein, the acting Kursk governor, said that his grandfather was from Sumy Oblast, so, quote, this land is not foreign to him. Now, we know from Western and Ukrainian sources that the Russian delegation at those talks in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago on May the 16th threatened to seize Sumy Oblast in order to create a security zone, in their words. Now, as the ISW say, the Kremlin likely arranged Monday's this little interaction for the cameras in order to frame Putin as an effective and engaged wartime leader by responding to these requests to further advance into Sumy Oblast, suggesting that Russia lay claim to more territory inside Ukraine. Now, as a reminder, Sumy city is about 25 km from the border. It's inside Ukraine, obviously. So while the threat there cannot be dismissed, given Russia's woeful military performance on the ground, I suggest that right now all this talk of quite how far the security zone or the buffer zone or whatever you want to make up for it should be is ridiculous, and it's adults cosplaying a game of Risk. However, to be more specific, don't take my jaundiced view for it, let's turn to the Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets. He says the Sumy area is currently threatened by Russia by elements of the Russian 18th and 72nd Motor Rifle Divisions and the 83rd Separate Airborne Brigade, plus a few regiments of National Guard in reinforcing them. Now, these forces are simply insufficient to seize a city as large as Sumy, pre-war population of about 260,000, let alone the wider area. Russian forces have not seized a Ukrainian city with a pre-war population greater than 100,000 since capturing Lysychansk in Luhansk Oblast in July 2022. Anyway, Putin also used the visit to Kursk Oblast to claim that Ukrainian troops had intentionally damaged monuments to the Second World War during their incursion, the one that started last August. He said the destruction of these monuments, quote, gives Russia every reason to say that these are people with neo-Nazi ideology. Of course it does. They're pushing the whole destruction of the monuments thing. We've made mention of it quite a lot in the last few weeks. They see it as a way of reinforcing the identity war. You'll remember we reported last week about those manufactured protests at a number of European embassies, I think 11, in Moscow ahead of the May the 9th Victory Day parade. They were claiming more cultural destruction, cultural attack, etc., etc. This is all to bolster the internal Russian narrative of fortress Russia being under attack from outside enemies. So we are going to see a lot more of that, and you'll hear lots more references to monuments being moved and torn down and disrespected and all that kind of stuff. But that, Francis, is us up to date.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace in Ukraine because he believes he's winning the war. No, not the words of Kaja Kallas, Gabrielis Lambergus or Boris Johnson, but those of Donald J. Trump, who, we learned today, admitted that on a call with European leaders earlier in the week, he said exactly that. Now, sources tell the Wall Street Journal that it was the first time Kyiv's European allies had heard the US president admit Putin was not seeking peace, running counter to all of those public claims Trump had made that Putin wants to end the war. According to Bild Zeitung, one of the major German newspapers, no one on that call dared question what this meant for US support of Ukraine as, in their words, everyone held their breath. Friedrich Merz, the new German chancellor, then tried to salvage things, suggesting that the West hold a technical meeting to discuss the upcoming talks. Something rather German about that, I think, to which Trump agreed. The fact that despite that admission, Trump still released the statement he made after his call with Putin speaks volumes as to his attitude towards the Russian president. It won't shock you at home, I know, but nonetheless, it is important we mark these moments. Europe, let's face it, shouldn't be shocked by any of this, and there is evidence it is engaged in a slow recalibrating of itself, although just how fundamentally and universally remains an open question. As our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell writes on our live blog today, Merz is in Vilnius visiting a German brigade deployed on NATO's eastern flank as we speak. There, he's affirmed that Germany is committed to spending 5% of annual GDP on defence by 2035, with 3.5% of GDP spent on essential military deployments, such as the rearming of the Bundeswehr, and an additional 1.5% earmarked for infrastructure. It was us at the Telegraph that revealed last month senior reservist officers fear that Germany's bridges are currently incapable of transporting German tanks. Pretty extraordinary story. Our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, meanwhile, also writes for our paper how the European Union will consider sanctioning countries which buy Russian oil under a plan to bring Putin to the negotiating table. This is something Zelensky has been pushing for some time. As we know, China is thought to represent around 47% of Russian oil sales, while India sits behind at around 38%. The EU and Turkey are on 6% each, which is obviously a considerable decline from where they were. But will the EU be willing to make that further step, given the member states' reliance on trade with China? I think many would be very hesitant to believe so. Of course, all of this is similar to what Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal are calling for in their bipartisan bill in the United States Senate. Yesterday, the former said that 81 senators now, I think it was about 79 last week, but so it is going up, are now supporting the call to put sanctions on secondary countries in order to compel Putin to stop. Graham wrote this yesterday. As Secretary Rubio indicated to the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, Russia has agreed to provide its term sheet for a ceasefire in the next few days. Its contents will speak volumes as to whether or not Russia is serious about peace. We suspect it will be more of the same. If it is more of the same, Russia can expect decisive action from the US Senate. To that end, we are beyond pleased that we now have 81 co-sponsors for legislation to sanction Russia for its barbaric invasion. Our legislation will isolate Russia, putting it on a trade island by imposing stiff tariffs on other countries that support these atrocities. One of the main priorities of our legislation is to hold China accountable for propping up Putin's war machine by buying cheap Russian oil from the shadow fleet. Without China's economic support, Putin's war machine would come to a grinding halt. While we yearn for peace, it is increasingly clear to us and a supermajority of the Senate that Putin is playing games. The Senate stands ready to act if these games continue. But there is no sign of those games abating, as Russia continues today to reject American proposals to establish a ceasefire before starting negotiations to end the war. As Graham just said, Marco Rubio stated 2 days ago the US is waiting for Russia to present a document outlining the terms that Russia would require in order to reach a ceasefire that would then allow for broader negotiations. But Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has now directly rejected the idea that Russia and Ukraine should come to a truce and then we'll see, his words. In fact, he confirmed Moscow has no interest in agreeing to negotiations and a ceasefire in Ukraine, saying yesterday that we don't want this anymore. His exact words. And in perhaps the most extreme statement that followed that we've seen for a while, Russian presidential advisor Anton Kobyakov said yesterday that the Soviet Union's founding body, the Congress of People's Deputies, was not involved in dissolving the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union still legally exists, and the war in Ukraine is therefore an internal process, an effective civil war. So somebody better quickly get on the phone to Friedrich Merz, because he's in Estonia as we speak, and that would mean that he's in the Soviet Union. That's not so good, so better get him out of there, I think. But two other political updates before I bring in our guest. This was a breaking story yesterday, just as we went on air. A former Ukrainian politician has been shot dead in what appears to be a professional hit job at the entrance of an exclusive school in Madrid. Andrei Portnov, a pro-Russian who worked as a close aide to President Viktor Yanukovych, the one who was ousted as a consequence of the Maidan revolution, was dropping off his daughters on Wednesday morning when motorcycle assassins shot him 5 times. It took place at the American School of Madrid, while other parents were dropping off their children. He was declared dead at the scene by emergency services, and the murderer is reported to have fled, and the police launching a manhunt. Now, Portnov is a complex figure, and I'm not going to go into all of the details now because this case is evolving as we speak. He was previously placed on sanctions lists by the EU and the United States, and a source told us yesterday that he was trying to secure safe passage to the UK when he was killed. The Spanish police's homicide group and forensic officers have taken charge of the investigation now, and their initial hypothesis for a motive points to a settling of scores, probably related to politics or unpaid debts. So, as I say, very much an evolving story, and we'll link in the show notes to an article that's currently updating with more information. But just finally, we've been reading a little bit more into the prisoner of war exchange between Ukraine and Russia agreed in Turkey last week. And as others have highlighted, when one gets into the gritty details, there are 3 categories involved: civilians, soldiers, and children. And it underscores that children have become considered participants in this war rather than a separate category outside of POW discussions. Some might say they're even being treated as hostages, with tens of thousands of children kidnapped by Russia from the occupied territories, something we've talked about so many times. That this isn't being considered more widely, being commented upon, is, I think, noteworthy of the shifting ways in which the war is changing our perception of what is acceptable. So, worthy of note, I think. But before we turn to Serhiy, I want to just stay on the subject of children a little bit longer, bringing in our education editor, Poppy Wood, to tell us about a story she published this week in The Telegraph, which came from a special episode of Ukraine the Latest. We wanted to share this story with you for 2 reasons. One, because it gives an insight into how we do our journalism here, but also because I think it offers hope of how change can happen from small beginnings. So welcome, Poppy. Now, for context, listeners may recall a few weeks ago, on the public holiday on the 21st of April, we released a special of the podcast called Childhood at War. And it was me visiting St Mary's Ukrainian School in London to interview refugee children about their experiences of leaving Ukraine when the invasion began and integrating into British life. That came about from an invitation I received to speak at the school. And whilst I was interviewing the children and speaking to the head teacher there, I began to hear about how some of the teenagers were being encouraged by their teachers in British schools to take Russian as their language course, either through ignorance or because those teachers believed they were more likely to get a good grade because of their Ukrainian language skills. There is not currently a Ukrainian GCSE offered. That's the exam course. So I strolled over to Poppy's desk and I asked her if she thought that there was a story there. So Poppy, do you want to pick up from there?
Sure, thanks for having me. So yeah, as you say, I listened to the episode of Ukraine the Latest, and it was really striking that lots of children were saying that they were being pressured by their schools to learn Russian at GCSE. So GCSEs are basically the first of 2 formal sets of exams that children in the UK take. It's actually a slightly different system in Scotland, but in the rest of the UK, they take their General Certificate of Secondary Education exams at 16, which is a quite broad set of subjects, about 10 or 11, and then they hone those down to 3 or 4 subjects age 18 for their A-levels. These children, lots of them were saying that they had been forced to take, or pressured or encouraged to take Russian GCSE because they basically didn't have another modern foreign language option. And actually the only compulsory GCSEs are English literature, English language, maths and science, but lots of schools take it upon themselves to encourage a modern foreign language. We started to speak around, and these Ukrainian children were saying that back in Ukraine, they had been learning English their whole lives as their modern foreign language. And, it was obviously very beneficial coming to the UK. They could speak really good English, but it meant that they didn't have in many cases, another modern foreign language to take for their exams, and particularly difficult if you're coming in an exam year or the year before an exam year, and you kind of have to scramble around for subjects. To get into colleges or sixth forms, you have to have a certain set of subjects. So these children were saying that two things happened. Either, as you said, schools were slightly ignorant of the fact that Ukrainian and Russian are different languages. Although they are similar and lots of Ukrainians do speak Russian, they are more like cousins. Or the schools were cognizant of the fact that they're different languages, but basically overlooked the fact that some of these children were saying, I don't really feel comfortable learning Russian in a formal way for my exams, and pressured them into signing up for their GCSE in the subject. So we did speak to lots of them who spoke in quite terse language or difficult language about how uncomfortable it was for them. Some of them said that they spoke Russian sort of informally, lived in cities that speak Russian as a second language or in many cases first language, but they weren't fluent Russian speakers. And others had absolutely no formal experience speaking Russian. One girl we spoke to called Luba said that she didn't speak Russian at home, but she got, quote, told to do Russian by her school. And she said it was really psychologically hard for her. She kept crying during Russian oral lessons, and she said she felt like she was betraying Ukraine by learning the language. Another girl, Liza from Kharkiv, said that she got, quote, forced to take Russian GCSE by her school, and that she was furious that she was made to do it while, quote, my friends, my relatives were dying in the city I was living in as a result of Russian bombing. Another boy, Vitalik, said that he was pressured to take Russian GCSE despite only being able to hold a short conversation in the language. He actually refused because he said, suggesting Ukrainians do Russian GCSE is cruel and dreadful. How can I do Russian GCSE when my people are being tortured and bombarded by Russians? It's ridiculous to me. So we don't have the actual data on the number of Ukrainian children that may have been forced to do this, but the closest thing we could look at was to look at the number of Russian GCSE entries and see how it had changed over the past few years. And we did see that there was a 47% jump in Russian GCSE entries between 2022, the year of the Russian invasion, and last year. So 3,484 pupils took Russian GCSE last summer, up from 2,376 in 2022. It's the highest jump of any of the languages that are counted as other modern foreign languages at GCSE, other than Persian, which jumped 50%. So some people might say, and some people have said, well, it's natural there's an increased interest in Russian GCSE given what's going on in the world, and Russia's received heightened attention, its role on the world stage, or, potentially Russian families fleeing to Britain from Moscow. But some people we spoke to said, at least 1,000 or so of those extra entries are going to be likely to be Ukrainian pupils that are pressured into doing this subject. Interestingly, when we were speaking to people about this, private schools came up, and especially top private schools, as some of the names of institutions that were potentially encouraging this. We chose not to name them because each school is likely to only have a handful of Ukrainian pupils, so we would be identifying them, and they asked to remain anonymous. In some respects, that's understandable because Russian is more likely to be a subject on offer at private schools where, resources are more plentiful, and state schools have had a difficult time and had to cut resources in the past few years. But interestingly, some of those top public schools, private schools that we looked at, they weren't offering Russian as a core subject, and they had made pupils sit Russian GCSE as external candidates, but then counted the top grades that the students inevitably received as their own, fantastic grades. We don't know for sure whether they're Ukrainian or not from looking at the raw statistics, but it does seem likely to be the case. So we spoke to lots of people who said, well, Russian is a useful language. It is playing a bigger role on the world stage. Surely that's understandable, and it's not the worst thing in the world. But we also spoke to Ina Hororovich, the head of St Mary's School that you went in and spoke to, and she said, well, at least part of what's going on here appears to be schools sort of ignoring how psychologically difficult it is for some of these pupils to be studying Russian during the war in a formal way, and appeared to be, or it looked like, they were potentially treating it as a sort of means to an end, to an easy top mark for both the pupil and, ultimately for the school as well. She actually wrote an op-ed for us on the subject, and she said, and I quote, "For these young people, the Russian language is not neutral. It is the language of the invading force used in propaganda, occupation and disinformation. It's the language that they've heard shouted during air raid sirens and military checkpoints, not the language of their family, their identity or their hopes for the future." She said it's understandable. Why should Ukrainian students feel like they have to learn their subject in a formal way? So we went to the government before we published our article, and they came back and said that they thought the allegations were really shocking. But it's not all bad news. They also said, well, we want to do something about this. Ukraine has been lobbying for Ukrainian GCSE to be formally introduced as an option. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, revealed to us that she has actually now written to exam boards in the UK and asked them to consider rolling out Ukrainian as a formal option. So whether or not that will happen is really down to the exam boards. The government have done all they can so far. And I suppose the toss-up that they're probably making is, well, is there enough appetite for this, or will interest in Ukrainian potentially not last very long beyond the war? We looked at the numbers of some of the other modern foreign languages on offer, and they're relatively low. I mean, well, there are 0 people taking Dutch for the past couple of years, sadly. Only a couple hundred people taking Gujarati, only a couple hundred people taking Bengali, even though, potentially high numbers of those language speakers in the UK. So with 35,000 Ukrainian children living in the UK, there's definitely enough at the moment to make the language worthwhile. But whether or not that sort of survives beyond our talk about the war is another question. But interestingly, some of the Ukrainian students we spoke to said, well, actually, some of my British friends at school have shown an interest in learning Ukrainian. And, as one day conversations will turn to rebuilding Ukraine, it will become a crucial language globally. So why shouldn't we just be ahead of the curve and get everyone learning it now?
Well, Poppy, thank you for all of your brilliant work on this story and for explaining it so well. We'll, of course, add a link in the show notes to that piece for those of you who are interested in reading more about it. It'll be really interesting to hear whether this is a wider issue internationally. So if you're a teacher or a student in another country in Europe, do get in touch. We're genuinely interested to hear more about your experience. And as I say, this is, I think, a sign of hope, really, that sometimes from small things, just raising the issues and highlighting them, you can have an impact. And who knows, perhaps one day soon there will be a formal announcement by one of these exam boards that they will create a Ukrainian GCSE. And that will mean a tremendous amount, I'm sure, to many Ukrainian refugees here in this country, but also, as Poppy says, for students who are interested in learning this language as a consequence of the horrors that we've experienced in the last 3 years. So a small story, perhaps, in the grand scheme of what we generally cover on Ukraine the Latest, but hopefully a symptom of broader issues and one that many of you at home will find interesting. So thank you very much, Poppy, for your insights on that. So now turning to our next guest, we're delighted and honoured to welcome to the Telegraph Serhiy Prytula, the founder of his foundation, which is one of the biggest charity organisations in Ukraine. Welcome to Ukraine the Latest. You were formerly best known in Ukraine as a TV and radio presenter, so you're no doubt very familiar with recording studios like the one we're in now. But since 2014, humanitarian assistance has been your main focus. You're originally delivering supplies for the Ukrainian military and involved in projects in the field of post-war recovery. And then since the full-scale invasion, have created a team of over 100 people to help the military and civilians affected by the war, raising over $250 million in the process. Now, there's so many topics we can cover today, but just to start off, you're here in London. Tell us about the British-Ukrainian alliance and the sharing of expertise you've been involved with in the past 3 years.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. It's a big honor to speak with such huge audience. And exactly, you mentioned about this Russian
GCSE.
Yes, sorry. So yesterday I spoke with my friends who live in London, and they told me about this trouble. That's the big dilemma for Ukrainian children here in UK, because on the one hand you have absolutely discomfort because of language of enemy, and another one hand you have possibility to have a better mark. So that's why we 100% thankful with all hospitality that you show to Ukrainian refugees, but of course for our children that's the serious trouble. What about our relations between allies Ukraine and UK? So we are absolutely thankful and happy that we have UK, because after some troubles with new administration in the United States and after Oval Office scandal between Mr. Trump and our President Zelensky, so we are more close in relations and in some decisions with United Kingdom and EU than with our previous general partner like United States of America. You mentioned about some cities in Ukraine in your news, for example, about Konstantinivka, which was again under attack of Russian gliding bombs last night. So I visited the Donbas region and Zaporizhia region 5 days ago before my trip to United Kingdom. And exactly I visited Drushkivka, a small town, very cozy town, and the 4 gliding bombs hit the city 2 hours before my visit. But it doesn't think that Ukrainians will give up or something like that. So the morale is still on a high level. Of course, people are terribly tired, but Russians, they have no such advantage on the front line as they want to have. Of course, we have huge trouble with fiber optic drones that they start to use about 6 months ago with a big number of them. There's a problem, and we're still looking for some solution what to do with this trouble. Exactly, fiber optic drones, that's one of the reasons of success counteroffensive of Russians in Kursk Oblast during the last 6 months. Another one reason, that's the North Korean troops. We had business there with special forces of North Korea, with young men under 25 in a good physical condition, and that was the serious force there. But we also have success stories on the battlefield, and 5 days ago, one of our brigade commanders, he told me about one absolutely mad story when our soldiers captured 3 Russian soldiers in Donbas region without weapon. They were without weapon. And our guys, they asked them, so what happened? Where's your machine guns or something like that? And the answer was that Russian commander said to his soldiers, so you need to walk about 8 miles from this point to another one, to Russian trenches, and don't take any ammunition or some guns, etc., because it's heavy and it will be hard for you to walk. But you will see a lot of corpses of Russian soldiers close to our position, so you will take anything that you want: grenades, ammo, machine guns, etc. So that's what can tell us about the value of human's life in Russia. So they just sent soldiers with empty arms, without anything in the way of Ukrainian positions.
Interesting. It's an extraordinary story. I mean, you're very much involved, your foundation, in the economy and military tech industries. And of course, we've seen over the last couple of years, especially, Ukraine become this sort of drone superpower and so involved in being at the forefront of military development. Can you talk a little bit more about your involvement in that as a sort of middleman, as a go-between, and the various different the Europeans and Ukraine?
So the power of foundation is that we are not state institute, yes. So we just Ukrainian NGO, we charity, and we don't waste time for some discussions, for some bureaucracy, etc. We work very close with dozens and dozens manufacturers in Ukraine, which produce everything unmanned: sea drones, UAVs, FPV drones, ground drones, which we use for logistic or for evacuation of our wounded soldiers, etc., etc., etc. So we have a huge experience of using it on a battlefield, and of course we have a high level of expertise, and that's why our foundation is really middleman between the manufacturers in Ukraine that can produce something for our armed forces and the dozens of companies and private persons from abroad who want to invest into Ukrainian militech. And they visiting our foundation and we share our expertise with our friends and partners. And exactly this visit of me and my colleagues to London, that's also mostly about advocacy and looking for some new partnership, but not about a crowdfunding campaign. So we will help them in Denmark and Finland next week, but here is more for another things. And exactly, Ukrainian mill tech is absolutely fantastic in the last few years. So the war that we had in 2022, 2023, and the war that we have now, it's absolutely different, because more than 75% of all targets that we hit on the battlefield, we do it with the drones. So the artillery systems on the second place, less than 20%. That's exactly the war of future that we have now in Ukraine. And that's why we're also asking our partners from abroad about supporting of Danish model, which was launched last year. We have our Ukrainian Defense Procurement Agency, which want to sign contract with some manufacturers that can produce artillery systems or drones or deep strikes, etc. But the Ukrainian state budget is really not big. So every other country have a possibility with the government's money to pay for this agreement between our agency and manufacturer. We had some contracts during last 12 months, about 1.5 billion euros. That's the possibility for Ukrainians to have more weapons, modern weapons, because with the same budget, you will produce in United Kingdom one number of something, in Ukraine 2 or 3 times more, because everything is more cheaper in Ukraine.
It's really interesting, and I know we've had many people on the podcast who've talked about being involved from other countries, involved in drone production in Ukraine. So it speaks to the enterprise that you've just described. I wonder, as part of your involvement in that world, in military tech and innovation, do you get a sense yet of what the next phase might be? If drones are the thing right now, is there any sense of what the next technology will be that will be transforming warfare?
I think that right now we have something unbelievable in Ukraine that nobody else have, and that's the future for other countries. So, because I never heard like US drones shut down Russian fighting jet under the Black Sea, or doesn't matter where. So, but we did it. We have absolutely fantastic examples of using the sea drones like platforms to bring other drones to the coast of Black Sea or Azov Sea, and to use them to hit targets on the ground on the distance of 20, 30, 40 kilometers from the place where they stopped, on the territories where Russians didn't expect for them. We can hit some air defense systems of Russian and make some part of sky clean, and after that just launch some missiles or some deep strike drones, etc. So that's the new Ukrainian currency, the experience that nobody have, but only Russians and now North Korea. So that's also an unbelievable thing. We are fighting with 2 nuclear countries at the same time. That's exactly what we want to share with our allies, with our partners, but also we want more involving to Ukrainian mill tech from your side.
Now, you speak about the relationships with other European countries, but it is more wide in the West as well at the moment. And you're, I should say, also have been involved in politics in the past, and more broadly in sort of the idea of civil society as an institution that exists outside of the sort of state apparatus. So what's your sense at the moment of how united the West is, and whether more can or should be being done from the perspective of Ukraine at the moment?
No, we have no united West. We have no. Just look at EU. Look at the behavior of Hungary and Slovakia. Look at the behavior of the United States. So we have a lot of allies, and we are very interesting with joint expedition forces, cool organization which unite Nordic countries, Baltic countries, and the UK leading there. So we're thinking that we also want to join. And 2 days before, I asked your officials, MPs from British Parliament, can you share some roadmap how we can join to this initiative? So absolutely one ambition that I have this time, that's just to survive. because nobody knows where will hit another time Russian missile. But I'm still alive, and I want to do everything that I can for our defenders. And exactly, I visited the United Kingdom several times in the last 2 years and a half, because my foundation, we bought 191 APCs and armored vehicles exactly in the United States and bring them to the front line. Spartans, Sultans, Samaritans, Samsons, FE-432, FE-434, Snatch Land Rover armored vehicles. So your military stocks around Birmingham are absolutely empty now because of our initiatives and activity. That's why we are searching and look for other markets around. And of course, we work close with Ukrainian manufacturers, because mostly 95% of drones are things that we produce in Ukraine. And every year, plus 1 million of them.
Another issue, of course, that's relevant to Ukraine's struggle at the moment is demographic in nature.
Absolutely terrible.
It's a subject people are quite often hesitant to talk about in detail. What's your perception on this?
It just hurt me, because we lost a lot of people because of war, because Russians kill us every day, not only our military but also civilian. In all regions, south of Ukraine, north of Ukraine, they don't care about women or kids or old people. We have about 7 million people in EU, our refugees that are staying there about 3 years, and we have about 5 million people that stay on the temporary occupied territories, and it's a big challenge for our economy. And the demographical situation is absolutely terrible, because we have now maybe less than 1 kid for 1 woman in Ukraine. And we try to look over horizon and try to find some solution. What can we do with this situation? And we have terrifier in rows of Ukrainian politicians, because no one wants to discuss in public migration policies. So we understand that we cannot recover Ukraine, the real Ukraine after the war, without the support of migrant workers. But Ukrainian society is scared about the examples of Germany, Belgium, France, and that's why there's the serious dialogue between power in Ukraine, between government and Ukrainian society. But I hope that everything will be okay, because Ukrainian society shows to the whole world that we are so strong and still strong. We're really surprised ourselves in 2022, because not only Western allies, but some part of Ukrainians start to believe in Russian propaganda about the weak Ukrainian civil society, about the failed state, about the Ukrainian oligarchs, corruption, etc., etc. But the fantastic example of people's initiatives, which didn't wait for some order from a presidential office or from government or parliamentary or MPs. So we're a little bit similar with UK citizens, because I studied your examples of volunteers, and as I remember, Spitfire jets you produced during the Second World War. So it was because of donations of citizens of United Kingdom, and you produced about 20,000 of them. And also this rescue operation from Dunkirk, when you sent everything that you have, all ships, all boats, to rescue you guys from France. That's also an example. But in Ukraine, we have 11 years of supporting by civil society of Ukrainian armed forces, and after 2022 it started to be a huge challenge, because our army grows up in 4 times, and we still are a very important part of this fighting against Russia. I mean, volunteers movement.
Do you think if there are adequate security guarantees in place and people feel confident that the war is over, that the Ukrainians who have left the country and have been in European countries and other countries around the world, do you think they will return? Or do you think the time is...
I'm afraid that big percent of Ukrainians will not return because of different reasons. First, this war didn't finish 2 years ago, 3 years ago, as many people was waiting for. After 3 years, many Ukrainian women found love in Czech Republic, Poland, or Germany, or United Kingdom, and create families. Many families decided to stay because of they have a job. Children grow up in local societies and study studying language and feel themselves happy. A lot of millions of Ukrainians have no possibility to return to nowhere. We have no more cities, Severodonetsk. We have no Popasna. We have no Bakhmut. We have no Solidar. We have no Lysychansk or Mariupol. Not only because they are under occupation temporary, but Russians destroy hundreds of Ukrainian villages, towns, and cities. People will not come back if they have no basic infrastructure for themselves, for families. You mentioned about some Putin's initiatives, or that he don't want to have a peace. You just look what he made with his troops. First, that he did after the Russian invasion in 2022, he destroyed Russian-speaking cities and Russian-speaking citizens that they killed. So never believe Putin words. If he will say you that I want to have some peace negotiations, it means that he wants just to take some more time. Because if you remember the last trying of negotiations in Istanbul, so Ukraine sent the top level of our officials. United States sent top level of our officials. And Russian and Putin sent some puppies. So nobody knows, unknown persons. It's not seriously. If you want to talk about peace, so you will talk about peace, but not waste time.
Well, that brings us on to the last topic I wanted to ask you about, which is justice. And of course, we've many times on this podcast spoken about justice in the context of war crimes and what officials are hoping might happen one day, although there are obviously optimists and pessimists with regard to that. But as somebody who's very involved in civil society in Ukraine, of course, there's also this issue of justice within Ukraine and the rule of law. And one of the accusations that's often made of Ukrainian society, particularly in the United States, amongst those who are perhaps more on the right, is around sort of corruption. I wonder if you can comment on your experience of that and battles against that in the country.
Battle against corruption? But corruption where? In Ukraine?
In Ukraine.
What did you hear about corruption in Ukraine? Sorry, but really, everything is not so terrible like people abroad think about the situation. Yes, I understand that we have corruption, but I think that all countries have some level of corruption. Just answer the simple question. When you heard about corruption in Belarus last time? I think that it's a hard question, because I think that many years ago. Why? I know Belarus because we are neighbors and I have friends there. And Belarus is absolutely corrupted country. But if you will talk about corruption in Belarus when you stay in Belarus, so tomorrow we'll be in jail. So they just shut up and keep silence and don't speak about corruption. The trouble of Ukraine that we have the most transparency anti-corruption infrastructure in the world, which we create with your help, guys, with the help of our West allies. And we work hard in this way, and we still have reforms. I don't want to do some advocacy of my government because as a citizen, I have a lot of questions to my president, and to my general staff, and to my government. But I'm absolutely sincere in the case that the case of corruption in Ukraine is not so huge like everybody can imagine, because of some people that spoke about that, like that's the main trouble in Ukraine. And unfortunately, Ukrainians start to believe in this problem in Ukraine more than some of our partners abroad. But we're still fighting, not on the front line, but with bribes, with some corrupted persons. And exactly, you mentioned about Andrei Portnov, which was killed yesterday in Madrid. So he was a good lawyer, but he was a bad citizen. So he was like absolutely evil for Ukrainians because of supporting of Yanukovych, because of supporting of Russian initiatives, exactly of occupation of Crimea Peninsula, and he helped them. And he escaped from Ukraine in 2014. And yesterday, I know some Ukrainian independence media which opened the bottles of champagne because of his death, because he passioned them. He used all possibilities to block the work of Ukrainian independent medias. So That's why I don't think that's Ukrainian special forces or Ukrainian intelligence made this event in Madrid, but I think that was Russians because as this guy Portnoy, he had the conflict with Kadyrov, which have a good network in the whole world. But that's the situation. So I don't want to talk about corruption in Ukraine because I have no example in my foundation daily work with some examples of corruption. Nobody asked me about some bribes. I have no any troubles with Ukrainian customs service when British APCs cross the border. So that's why we'd like to talk more in Ukraine about the unity in Ukraine, because the Russians, they dream about a dividing of Ukrainian society. That's why the most important thing that my foundation do is not only to bring something to the front line to answer for requests of our soldiers, but also to create some platforms which give a possibility to keep this unity strong.
Thanks, Serhiy. Delighted to hear that the 432 family are being used again, the vehicles in Ukraine. I've bashed many a knee in a 432 over the years, and a few other bits and pieces as well. I just wanted to ask you, you raised the issue there of corruption, and we're asked often about it, and it's something that we rarely get any hard information on to be able to form an opinion, so it's very difficult to talk about. I just want to get your view from society. So President Zelensky has been very clear about working hard to, as you say, it's prevalent in all walks of life in all countries, and he's been very clear about trying to root it out where he can see it, including up to getting rid of Alexei Reznikov, the former defence minister, who we are told was himself not subject to any corruption investigations, but he was the head of the defence department where some practices were uncovered, and so he had to go. So Zelensky's been pretty brutal about cutting this stuff out where he can see it, and that's laudable. And I just wonder what the view is from society about when these issues do come up. Is it seen as, well, that's good that we're clearing out the stable and making Ukraine a much better and more transparent place to do business and to work and live and all the rest of it, or does society see it as, oh my God, it's still going on? Or so each individual case, is it sort of good news or bad news when these things do bubble up?
Oh, this is a difficult question. Everything complicated in Ukraine because you have business with society which totally suffered last someone 3 years, someone 11 years because of war, because of Russians, and people want the justice on the first place. And it's not only about the justice if we talk about to punish the war crimes from Russia or Belarus or Iran. Doesn't matter, it was people in trenches or some people who made an order for them to kill Ukrainians. That's the request number one in Ukrainian society, and that's why we hope that we will be not alone in the case of punishing of Russian war crimes, because our intelligence, our secret service, they do their job as well, and sometimes you can hear some news from Russia that some submarine commander was dead by shooting in Russia, or some head of engineering company dead, etc., etc. But also we care about situation inside. Ukrainian society want to punish also some people who was corrupted during this war, because that's also about the death of Ukrainian soldiers. So if you stole something, and if we didn't buy some helmets or some APCs or some drones, etc., so you play with the Russians on the same page. But we have our courts. We have our institutions that can investigate everything. So please let us to do justice inside Ukraine, in Ukraine, by ourselves. 100% that we will do it. But the trouble of Ukraine at that moment is that mostly all people, the most proactive part of Ukrainian civil society, they are in trenches now. I tell because my closest friends died 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, dozens of them. which supports some volunteers initiatives in local communities, like to save some green zones, like to save some historical buildings, like to do some other ecological initiatives. People didn't like them because they think that maybe they do something for money or something like that. But now they start to understand what we lost exactly on the front line. And the big challenge for me, for my colleagues, for other people who have some influence in Ukraine, that's to help to grow up new leaders in local communities, people who can lead, show more responsibility, because, as you mentioned, we have huge trouble with demographical situation. So it means that everyone Ukrainian need to work for 2 or 3 people now.
Well, thank you very much, Serhiy. We'll come to you for your final thought in a moment. But first, over to Dom.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So I'd like to take up a letter that came to us from Brandon in Maine in the US. Brandon, thanks for getting in touch. He says, dear team, on today's Ukraine, the latest episodes, I think this must have been 2 days ago. I think this is probably Tuesday. He said, Dom talked at length about the Russian motorcycle tactics and analysed that it was indicative of a lack of armoured vehicles and desperation. I had come to the same conclusion, but coincidentally today I also noticed that Ukraine is adopting similar tactics for at least one of its units. Does this indicate that Ukraine acknowledges the effectiveness of these tactics? I'll come back to that, effectiveness. Or does this indicate to a degree that Ukraine is dealing with a lack of armoured vehicles as well? I'll come back to that. Brandon says, I would love to hear a follow-up analysis from Dom now that we are seeing this tactic being taken up by Ukraine as well. Sincerely, Brandon from Maine in the USA. Brandon, thank you so much for getting in touch, and thank you everybody who does send us questions. We try and answer as many as we can here on the show, and directly we do reply where we can. I would point you towards our newsletter, because we've now got a section in the newsletter, the weekly newsletter, where we will definitely, we are dedicated to answering a series of questions there. So please do send them into our newsletter, and we will answer more questions there all the time. But in answer to Brandon's question, I think you're talking about Ukraine's 425th Skala Separate Assault Regiment. They reported on Tuesday that they had formed the first motorcycle company within the regiment and tasked it with conducting what they say is adaptable assault operations to quickly break through Russian positions. Right, okay. Now, the quick bit, I agree with. A motorcycle can get up to some big licks, as we say. But to what end? I mean, I come back to your point there, Brandon, about effectiveness and lack of armoured vehicles. I made the point the other day that these are effectively like airborne forces, like light troops, when you've just got sort of belt kit and you've got ammunition, water, food, med supplies. That's pretty much what you're wearing. Light troops need reinforcement fast. So these motorcycle troops, they might get onto a position very quickly, but they do in very short order need to be backed up by something. Otherwise, they're just not going to be able to defend themselves. Now, I made the point the other day that I thought this was because of the lack of Russian armoured vehicles and a bit of desperation. And I make the absolute same point here for Ukraine. This is a tactic. I'm not suggesting it's brand new. Motorcycles have been in the British Army for, generations. You'll find footage of Lawrence of Arabia on a motorbike. In fact, he was killed on a motorbike, wasn't he? So motorbikes have been used in military service for years. Now, massing them like this as an assault tactic has not really been seen before because it's not very effective. It's quite easy to stop that. So I do think it all comes down to a lack of other vehicles of getting troops in position and an effort to try and do something. They are fast, they can get through a position if you can get there and all the rest of it, but I make the point that you do need to be backed up very quickly. So I do make the same points for Russia and Ukraine, but I would just finish with by thanking Brandon again and saying, whilst it might smack of lack of armoured vehicles and a bit of desperation, only one of the countries attempting this in Ukraine has claimed to be the second best and biggest army in the world.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for your final thoughts there. And Poppy, as our other guest today, what's your final thought?
I think I just wanted to say that, when we talk about Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine, we obviously, understandably, talk about the conflict and the casualties and the actual war fighting on the ground. But the refugee narrative is one that's just not spoken about as often. And although the story about Ukrainian children being pressure to take a Russian GCSE is fairly small in the grand scheme of things, it does speak to, I think, just a wider element of, as societies, we should be exploring more what happens when refugee populations move to other countries. I think it's slightly written off as sort of happily ever after narrative. But by its very nature, people that come to this country as refugees are fragmented. There are often only a few school places in each district. They get sent to different regions. It is a fragmented story. They're often texting their friends back at home in Ukraine and hearing about things in bits and bobs. It's also quite hard to report on sometimes because refugees pop up in certain bits of data, but they are invisible in other bits of data. So it's taught me to be just read between the lines a little bit more and just to be a bit more conscious of the fact that, 35,000 children at least are trying to assimilate into life in the UK, but also that, it isn't happily ever after, and many of them do want to go home after the war finishes. Speaking to lots of them about the Ukrainian GCSE that's potentially on the cards, they're saying, oh, this is great because now Ukrainian children in the UK can keep up with their language so that they'll be tip-top when they go back home. So it's not just a case of, 35,000 children are here and they're here to stay and they'll go on to live their whole lives here in the UK. It's a very complex story, and it's one that I think as a country we should just be a little bit more sensitive to and more interested in to find out how it's panned out.
I just want to take 1 minute to community of English Town East Moon. Thank you for your support of our initiative Nest, and we bought modular houses for people who lost them because of Russians in 2023. Thank you for supporting your donations. Also, thank you for community of Aberfeldy in Scotland for your donations also. Great thanks to the big friend of our foundation. Is a professor of one of a high-level university here in UK, which send every month 100 and 150 pounds, like old school, in letters, not with the bank account transfer, but in letters, and we really appreciate it. And I want to thanks to all people from your audience who support Ukrainians in such tough times last 3 years. And United Kingdom is on the first place with donations to our foundation's bank accounts. First place, Ukraine. Of course, on the second place, United States, because we also have Prytula Foundation USA and rise donations there. On the third place, we have Poland because of huge diaspora there of Ukrainians. And on the fourth place, we have United Kingdom. This podcast is also opportunity for my foundation to raise some money with the help of our supporters and spend them for some needs of our units on the front line. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery, so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.